Hi, everyone, this is the Encyclopedia channel. The book that this program interprets for you is The Empire of Depression, A New History. The author of this book is American scholar Jonathan Sadowski, whose field of expertise is the history of psychology. Published in 2021, the response was very enthusiastic, and it was quickly translated into various language versions. In the 21st century, the word depression appears more and more frequently in people's daily life. Many celebrities have been exposed to suffer from depression, and the daily work and life of ordinary people are often dragged down by depression. Many others feel sad and tired, but are not sure whether this is a normal mood or depression. So, how can you tell if you have depression? What is the nature of depression as a disease? What are the prevailing views on depression? Can depression be treated with medication? After listening to this episode, you will understand. Under the public's attention, there are endless books on depression on the market, many of which claim to be able to help people with emotional problems. Among the books on depression, Empire of Depression is unique. This book succinctly and systematically sorts out the concept, theory, treatment status, and culture of depression, and because it is rare to tell you honestly what those self-help manuals and psychologists will not tell you, what else about depression is doubted, misunderstood, or unknown by scientists. What impact do these doubts, prejudices, and blind spots have on the prevention and treatment of depression, and even our daily life? It can be said that Empire of Depression not only updated our knowledge about depression, but perhaps also refreshed our understanding of psychiatry and even medicine as a whole. Next, we will divide this book into 3 parts. In the first part, how people in different times and cultures understand depression. In the second part, let's take a look again. What is the essence of depression as a disease? Should we understand depression psychologically, socially, or chemically? The author will introduce and evaluate these 3 mainstream views on depression. In the third part, we return to today's daily life. The diagnosis rate of depression in the 21st century is getting higher and higher. Depression seems to have become an empire in the field of psychiatry. Are we really entering a more depressive age, or is the concept of depression being overused? By answering these questions, we can not only see depression in a different light, but also gain a deeper understanding of our own emotions. First part. How people of different eras and cultures understand depression. You know, since ancient times, human beings have struggled with pathological depression, and countless treatment options have been proposed. However, there is a long way to go from paying attention to a pathological condition, to confirming a disease, and to fully understanding the disease. Changes in the understanding of depression have been accompanied by countless bold and even risky medical practices. Although scientists have been studying depression since the 19th century, it was not until 1980 that the psychiatric community officially recognized depression as a clinical disease and included it in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. At that time, whether it was really necessary to set up such a new name, whether the name depression was accurate enough, and what were the key symptoms to define depression. These issues were also very controversial. Even today, human science still doesn't know enough about depression, and we still don't know the complete pathological mechanism of the disease. Most of the depression drugs were found to have side effects of improving depression in other experiments, and then they were put into use, even after depression was written into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Every revision of the manual will make major changes to the depression-related items. That said, our understanding of depression is still evolving. In different eras and cultural backgrounds, people have different understandings of depression. Generally speaking, for a disease to be recognized, its symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment need to be as objective and universal as possible. However, the symptoms and diagnosis of depression appear to be highly culturally influenced, with much higher rates of diagnosis in Europe and the United States than elsewhere, and for unclear reasons. According to one study, more than 1 in 9 Americans received medication for depression between 2011 and 2014, and that percentage is only going to be higher now. You may also find that in American TV series, people go to the psychiatrist because of depression, which is like a routine. The author of this book also gave an example. In the United States, there is a female student named Ifemelu from Nigeria. She is a refugee and has no legal status in the United States. Therefore, she cannot find a job and has many difficulties in life. Soon, Ifemelu developed symptoms such as lethargy, sadness, and social withdrawal. Her aunt, an American-trained psychiatrist, thought it was classic depression. But Ifemelu retorted to her aunt, saying, "It is not science at all to attribute all problems in life to mental illness, and to diagnose all discomfort as depression, but just a kind of American culture." She thinks that her condition is not an illness, but a normal reaction when faced with major difficulties. As long as she gets her identity and finds a job, she will be fine. Later, Ifemelu did solve her psychological problems by improving her living conditions. Of course, this does not mean that depression is not an objective disease, but this Nigerian girl did reveal a possibility. Is the so-called depression just a way for European and American cultures to understand grief? There is a term specifically used to describe a mental illness that is highly bound to culture, called cultural conditioning syndrome, also known as cultural binding syndrome. It refers to a series of symptoms related to cultural background. Only people of certain ethnic groups or regions will report these symptoms at the same time, and some symptoms even appear only in these ethnic groups or regions. The locals will use these symptoms to name a disease, but this disease is not recognized by the outside world. Common cultural conditioning syndromes include Malaysian penis shrinkage, Korean fire sickness, Arctic hysteria, and so on. Many scholars believe that most cultural conditioning syndromes are not independent diseases, but special symptoms of other problems under the influence of culture, or a cultural habit at all. So, could depression be a culturally conditioned syndrome? The view of the author of this book, Sadowski, is that the existence of depression is not only supported by a large amount of evidence, but also has general social significance. What is culturally conditioned is not so much depression as it is the prevailing understanding of depression in modern psychiatry and psychology. The author acknowledges that the naming of depression itself is closely related to Western history, especially modern Western history. From ancient Greece to the Christian Middle Ages, people have been tirelessly naming, analyzing, and treating excessive melancholy. When anatomy was just emerging, people were even more keen to find the cause of depression in the body. It can be said that before psychiatry and psychology were developed in Western medicine, research on depression was already in full swing, and even a large number of books were published. It's just that different nomenclature and knowledge systems have been formed in different eras. At that time, the name depression was not yet popular. With the rise of humanism, Europeans began to associate depression with the essence of human beings, believing that it is the embodiment of the nobility and sensitivity of human nature. This understanding also has a cultural background. For example, Shakespeare's Hamlet is a representative of this noble melancholy. Because his father was murdered and the throne was usurped, he felt the ugliness of the world and became weary of the world. He doubted the meaning of existence and the essence of human beings, and raised the famous question of to be or not to be. This sad, contemplative, intelligent, and literary charming state in Hamlet is called melancholy. The opposite of melancholy is the state of mind of Hamlet's girlfriend Ophelia. Ophelia also suffered misfortune, but she was overwhelmed by grief and went mad and lost her mind, a state called depression. It was believed at the time that noble melancholy could only be found in European men and only morbid melancholy in women. As for people outside Europe, such as the African slaves they could come into contact with, they did not understand these complicated worries at all. Don't think that these are all things of the past. The cultural prejudices of the past still affect the psychiatry and psychology dominated by Europe and America today. Today, women still predominantly seek medical treatment for depression, which in turn has led to doctors only determining diagnostic criteria based on the symptoms of female patients. Even if men have the courage to treat morbid depression, they are often misdiagnosed. At the same time, studies in many European and American countries have shown that compared with whites, the diagnosis of depression in people of color is more stringent, and many doctors are more inclined to diagnose schizophrenia rather than depression in people of color. Insufficient understanding, frequent changes in standards, constraints of cultural factors, and influence of personal judgment are all challenging the rationality of the existence of depression. However, the author believes that these uncertainties and cultural influences have appeared in the process of human understanding of many diseases. For example, Alzheimer's disease, which is also a mental disease, is also a disease that was recognized before the brain mechanism was confirmed, This is especially true for the famous tuberculosis. Besides, even if medicine does not admit it, does this disease not exist? The author further pointed out that medicine is both a science and a social consensus. He cites psychiatrist Nancy Anderson, pointing out that in the entire history of medicine, no one has ever managed to find the line between disease and health. In other words, let alone a specific disease, even the category of disease itself has no clear definition. Therefore, instead of going into a blind alley that is objective and pure with clear boundaries, it is better to consider people's needs and feelings. These needs and feelings are also real. Although the knowledge system of depression is influenced by European and American culture, the shadow of depression can also be found in the cultural conditioning syndrome of many other ethnic groups. All along the world, depression can have many secondary faces, such as hysteria, neurasthenia, sinking heart, fire, and even a sentence "this person always thinks too much." These deformations are not so much challenging the existence of depression as it is enriching the content of depression. Today, most experts agree that depression is not a single set of symptoms and that its symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment are culturally influenced. And the author's attitude is, in any case, naming depression helps patients express their pain. Seeing pain as a problem is the first step towards solving it. The second part. Next, let's take a look at the main differences in the academic circles about depression. What is the nature of depression? Is it psychological, social, or chemical? And that's what our second part is about. At first glance, this question sounds like some abstract metaphysics, but it is this abstract question that determines whether people will treat depression and what methods are used to treat depression. At the same time, the author also reminds people there is no need to adopt an either-or approach to the essence of depression, and different treatment methods are not completely exclusive. Medicine used to take a detour on this point. In modern medicine, psychological theory is the most well-known. The pioneer of psychological theory is the school of psychoanalysis. The founder of this school, Freud, discussed depression in a famous essay Mourning and Melancholia. He believes that the root of depression is that a person has lost something important, but for some reason cannot express it, or is unwilling to admit it to himself, causing the anger to turn inward. To treat depression, talk therapy can be used to allow doctors to dig deep into the patient's subconscious mind and guide him to realize the real source of his anger and sense of loss, thereby alleviating the condition. Jung, the representative of another branch of psychoanalysis, believed that the root of depression is low mental energy. Why is mental energy low? Because it is transferred from the external conscious world and transformed inward into the inner subconscious mind. Jung believed that when a depressed patient feels a lack of energy and cannot concentrate on dealing with daily life, the subconscious mind is actually telling him, "Hey, don't make a fuss about external things, pay attention to me, I have something to tell you." Jung, like Freud, advocated the use of talk therapy to treat depression, but he believed that what doctors should guide patients to discover in the subconscious is not the repressed pain, but an opportunity to change their cognition and behavior patterns without realizing it. In addition to the psychoanalytic school, another school that is now popular in clinics, cognitive behavioral therapy, also believes that the root of depression is psychological. This school believes that the root of depression is the patient's wrong logical thinking, such as thinking that everything is his own fault, or that he cannot control his life, and so on. Doctors can start with behavior and thinking at the same time, correct these biased concepts, and the condition will naturally be relieved. The social view is a second view on the nature of depression. There is an important controversy surrounding this idea. Does depression and suffering still count as depression if there are legitimate social reasons for it? Many people don't think depression is depression when it's well-founded, and Ifemelu, the aforementioned Nigerian refugee student, apparently thinks so. In daily life, there are always people who joked, "You are not depressed," but a normal reaction to having no money, no job, and no love. The subtext of the joke is the same, only sadness that lacks a plausible real reason is depression. Earlier psychiatry also held this view. However, psychiatrists have gradually changed their views as the focus of treatment has gradually shifted towards relieving symptoms. The fifth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 2013 determined that when a person feels mental distress, even if the distress has reasonable social causes, it does not prevent him from being diagnosed with depression, and excessive sadness for any reason can be treated as depression. Some psychologists, especially the scholars of the psychoanalytic school, opened up another path to study depression and began to look for the social causes of depression. As mentioned earlier, depression is often diagnosed more frequently in women than in men, partly because of the conventional wisdom that men's sadness is a sign of wisdom, and women's sadness is a disease that needs treatment. In addition, society does not encourage men to show vulnerable emotions, making men's depressive symptoms more hidden, which is also a reason. In addition to these, scholars have also observed that social discrimination and gender inequality do make women more frequently fall into isolated and stressful situations, and mainstream discourse downplays these pains, which makes women more likely to suffer from depression. Similarly, many studies have shown that disadvantaged groups are more likely to be depressed. People who were abused in childhood, disabled or sick children, refugees and exiles, and of course low-income people, are more likely to suffer from depression. Although people rarely encounter poor people who suffer from depression in their daily lives, the authors caution, the connection between poverty and depression is actually very natural. Social analysis of depression makes sense because it helps patients avoid blaming themselves for all the problems. It also lets psychiatrists and psychologists know which populations are underrepresented. Depressed patients who rarely live in poverty may simply not have the time or money to see a doctor. Medicine treats depression as a disease and pays attention to the improvement of symptoms, which has also led to the gradual rise of the chemical theory. This is the third view on the nature of depression, and it is currently the dominant view in clinical practice. Scientists have been trying to treat depression with drugs and surgery. Neurosyphilis, lobotomy, insulin coma therapy, and convulsion therapy have been used. These methods are either ineffective or have too many side effects, and have been gradually eliminated. Around the 1950s and 1960s, scientists finally discovered that the lack of neurotransmitters, either insufficient supply or abnormal receptor function, was an important cause of depression. To put it simply, a neurotransmitter is an output tool of a neuron. A neuron, that is, a nerve cell, synthesizes a neurotransmitter and releases it into the synaptic gap at the end, where the neurotransmitter meets the receptor on the next neuron, binds with them, undergoes a chemical reaction, and the nerve signal is transmitted. Neurotransmitters allow a person to stay awake, experience rich emotions, learn quickly, recognize and remember, perform bodily movement, and more. If these neurotransmitters are missing or cannot be delivered for some reason, people will be numb, lethargic, and sluggish. Scientists don't yet know what causes the lack of these neurotransmitters, nor can they create them out of thin air, but they have found that the disappearance of these neurotransmitters can be inhibited by drugs. According to this principle, a well-known drug Prozac came into being. With its relatively stable efficacy and relatively few side effects, Prozac quickly became the most commonly prescribed drug for depression and is still used today. The author of this book believes that Prozac not only alleviates the symptoms of depression, but also completely changes the society's understanding of depression. Now that the disease can be cured, doctors no longer need to spend time and laboriously analyzing the personal and social causes of depression and conduct lengthy psychological counseling. Since then, depression has truly become a clinical disease like pneumonia and gastric ulcer. There are standardized diagnosis and treatment methods, and predictable curative effects. After the widespread clinical use of depression drugs, the number of clinical depression diagnoses increased greatly. Doctors began to describe depression as a mediocre mental cold. Non-depressed patients also began to follow the doctor's advice to buy various antidepressants to increase happiness and improve efficiency. Antidepressants have changed not only how people think about depression, but also how people think about their mental health and their relationship to their own souls. Therefore, the authors argue, the era following the invention of antidepressants could be called the Prozac era. Today, we're still living in the Prozac age. In general, regarding the nature of depression, there are three views that are justified. The psychological theory emphasizes the uniqueness of individual cases and helps patients break through themselves. The social theory makes depression go beyond the individual level, looking for the social pain caused by the system. The chemical theory is dedicated to simple and direct relief of painful symptoms. Around these three viewpoints, there are many controversies. But the author believes that this is not an either-or problem. Depression is both personal and social. It is both psychological and physical. The third part, From the previous explanations, we can see that the author has a positive attitude towards the confirmation, diagnosis, and treatment of depression, but he also mentioned a common concern. Since the second half of the 20th century, people's understanding of depression has continued to increase, and more people have been diagnosed with depression. Especially in the 21st century, it seems that most people feel that they have been or are suffering from depression. Are we already in the age of depression, or is the concept of depression being misused? This is the third part of our explanation. Many people have raised similar questions in daily life. The author is open to this question, but his clear discussion ideas are worth our understanding. First, the authors acknowledge that depression has gradually replaced other concepts as the dominant way of explaining mental distress in Western psychiatry and society. This shift has had widespread implications, leading to a massive increase in the diagnosis of depression worldwide. In this sense, he says that depression and its culture have become an empire, which is where the title of the book, Empire of Depression, comes from. However, the increase in depression diagnoses isn't necessarily because doctors are abusing the concept. The most common possibility is that more patients who were previously missed are now being diagnosed. As mentioned earlier, Europeans and Americans used to think that European and American men rarely suffer from depression, that people of color do not suffer from depression at all, and that no one cares about the mental health of disadvantaged groups. Today, these conditions are partially corrected. In developing countries, as economies develop, more people are able to take care of their mental health, and the stigma surrounding depression decreases. These factors can all lead to an increase in depression diagnoses. Another possibility for the increase in depression diagnoses is that people are actually more depressed. Many people feel that this is a depressing time, people are isolated, life is fast-paced, and competition is high. Those who hold this view need to answer a question: no matter how bad life is today, it is better than in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Why is the diagnosis rate of depression now higher? The author believes that although today's material life is good, people's state of mind has indeed changed. He recalled that in the middle of the 20th century, there were a lot of diagnoses of anxiety disorders, and some people called it the age of anxiety disorders, and now we have ushered in the era of depression. The borderline between the two disorders is blurry, but there is an intuitive distinction. Anxiety is the anticipation of impending danger, while depression is the sense of loss that has already been felt. In the middle of the 20th century, the post-war economy bottomed out, and various industries developed ambitiously. People had hope for the future, but they worried that the Cold War would turn into a hot war, or that they could not keep up with the trend of the times, so they generally felt anxious. After the 1970s, the neoliberal economy prevailing in the world has widened the gap between the rich and the poor, and the overall economic growth has slowed down. People generally feel disappointed, disillusioned, deprived, and no longer believe in progress. At the same time, neoliberalism has created a self-interested social atmosphere. The relationship between people is broken, and the social support network is disintegrated. People's anger can only be turned inward and to themselves, as Freud said, and manifested as depression. A third possibility for increased diagnoses of depression is naturally a change in diagnostic criteria, or diagnostic drift, in the terminology in the book. The authors caution that diagnostic drift is not necessarily a bad thing, and is caused in part by developments in conventional medicine. Hospitals used to have few such outpatient departments, and there were few psychiatric and psychological clinics, so only the most severely depressed patients were diagnosed and admitted to the hospital. Treatment methods are risky and painful, and they also make people afraid to admit that they have depression. With the increase of clinic treatment institutions, more and more patients with mild symptoms are diagnosed, and drug treatment is less contradictory. Of course, there is one situation that cannot be ruled out. Convenient drug treatment induces doctors to frequently diagnose depression. In the words of the book, if you have a hammer in your hand, you will find nails everywhere. Starting with Prozac, the effect of drugs became more and more significant, and it also led to people's worship of drugs. Doctors want to replace endless conversations and vague analyses with drugs. Among the patients, some hope that medicine can help them get rid of all negative emotions and become a positive and healthy person forever. Some people are eager to prescribe medicine just to prove that they are not lazy, but sick, and then enjoy some social immunity brought by their status as patients. some even hope that medicine can help them solve their external difficulties and make life smooth. As mentioned earlier, not only has the number of people diagnosed with depression increased, but many undiagnosed people are actively taking medication to improve their mood. The authors worry that the drug epidemic is having a cultural side effect. People are becoming so intolerant of negative emotions that they treat all suffering as a disease. This situation is partly because some pharmaceutical companies overly beautify the effects of drugs and promote chemical happiness that is readily available, making people think that antidepressants are happiness drugs, partly because some companies have found growth points in antidepressant drugs, hoping that taking drugs can reduce absenteeism, improve efficiency, and work happily. Clearly, substance abuse is a form of emotional exploitation of self or others, and drugs do not fulfill these desires. The author warns, if a person is superstitious about drugs, the symptoms may be aggravated because the curative effect does not meet expectations, and if a company is superstitious about drugs, it may harm the health and enthusiasm of employees, and harm its own interests in the long run. Now, let's review together. First, the author discusses the ambiguities surrounding the concept of depression, especially its socio-cultural attributes, and then states his view that although it cannot be precisely measured, formal naming of depression is both reasonable and necessary. Then, the author introduced 3 theories about the nature of depression: psychological theory, social theory, and chemical theory. He believes that these 3 theories describe different aspects of depression, but they are actually established at the same time. Finally, he answers a common question: are we living in an age of depression? He kept the issue open, but suggested 3 possible reasons for the increase in depression diagnoses, and raised his own concerns about the misuse of the concept of depression. Hearing this, you might think that there is a lot of ambiguity surrounding depression. That's right. On the one hand, the author frankly admits the limitations of human understanding of depression. On the other hand, he also reminds readers, ambiguity and prudence are actually the norm in medicine. Modern medicine is both a science and a social consensus. It has irrefutable usefulness, but also has its own boundaries and limitations. Depression needs to be treated as a disease, but not just a disease. In fact, this should also be the attitude of human beings towards many other diseases. This is the end of this episode of the show. What do you think about it differently? Welcome to leave a message to discuss with everyone. Hey, if you like our channel, please subscribe us. Haha, remember to like it.